We start with Unit 1 of Module 7 to put it a bit, administratively. So this is about learning by social interaction. All 3 or 4 units do address the issue of learning by social interaction, basically, but I've tried to make a distinction. And the first unit addresses a few theoretical positions by Bandura, Vygotsky, and Bakhtin, and the issue of cognitive apprenticeship. So Vygotsky and Bakhtin are obviously Russian pedagogues, psychologists, or even philosophers, whereas Bandura and the cognitive apprenticeship approach is evidently American. So to start with Bandura, he did his work already back in the 80s of the last century. He was basically, you might call him a neo-behaviorist, because he was interested in the influence of the consequences of behavior on behavior itself. So learning by observing, or even taking into consideration the consequences, the reinforcements. But the interesting point was that Bandura did not think that performing itself is necessary in order to learn, as most behaviorists do, as you know. But he had the idea, and also showed it in a lot of research, that observing the consequences of behavior being performed by other people, so observing other people and seeing what the consequences of their behavior is, in terms of reinforcement, is also a source of learning. So you can learn by observing others, basically, and see what happens after people do something. For instance, children play very roughly and aggressively, and a video sequence also shows the consequences, the intervention by the teacher, and that has effect on the child who is viewing this particular video. Vicarious experiences is this called. So the experiences are not the experiences of the learner, or the observer, but they are the experiences of the people who have been shown in a video, something like that. So in order to benefit from these experiences, these vicarious experiences, of course, the responses which are shown should be well known by the observer, so he or she should be able to actually perform the particular response. But it's also necessary, of course, that the observer is able to alter his or her expectation of reinforcements, because these changes in expectations of reinforcements are actually the learning process. So you can see this in various examples, and it is not necessary to consciously, extract the consequences by observing a video in order to learn. So it's not a matter of intentional learning, as the behaviorists use it, similar to the position of the behaviorist perspective. Learning is not a matter of conscious intention, but it just happens. It's an autonomous process, in fact. So take the example of people who are attending in the cinema a film in which, sort of James Bond film, in which cars are chasing after each other and drive very, very hard and perhaps dangerously. Well, people tend to and when they go home after having seen the movie, they tend to drive indeed at a higher speed compared to people who have seen a more neutral movie. So there is this consequence, your hero acts in a particular way, and you are going to copy that behavior because, yeah, well, you see that it has been rewarded. Okay, so that is happening, and it is in a very important source of learning. It's even an innate, sort of faculty of people to learn in this way. An interesting point is the point raised by Bandura that people also learn grammatical rules like using the past tense in a sentence through imitation, through hearing other people doing this. This runs a bit against the ideas of Chomsky, for instance, who claimed that there exists something like a language acquisition device, so a structure, basically an inherited structure, which allows you to develop, the command of grammar, the use of your language, your home tongue, so to speak. And this is not a matter of being rewarded or other, as we remember from the debates between Noam Chomsky and Skinner, who of course fight each other on this issue and on other issues as well. So the idea that grammatical rules can be learned through observation or imitation is in line with the behaviorist view, but not with Chomsky's view. There is a way to reconcile both positions by assuming that there is something like an inherited toolbox or an inherited opportunity, faculty, structure, or whatever you would like to call it, to actually arrive at a high level of cognitive performance, but you need to learn how to operate the tools which are in the toolbox. So it's the same discussion as around intelligence. So intelligence is to a certain extent inherited. It's based on the possibility to use particular cognitive structures in the brain, and these structures should be there, these tools should be there, but, and that's the important thing, children have to learn how to work with these tools. So education is very important, particularly primary education, because that's the place where children learn how to work with their cognitive tools. So the toolbox should be opened and used, and only when you do that, as a child, you are able to develop your intellectual, let's say, capabilities, your talent, if you would like to call it that way. It's not as a matter of just using, but it's a matter of learning to use. So this might be the case here as well in the case of the grammatical rules. You can imagine that the ability to develop the command or the mastery of grammatical rules is innate and may be situated in a kind of structure like a language acquisition device, but you need the experience, also the opportunity to observe others or hear others use grammatical rules in order to be able to work with these tools. That's the basic idea. So you have, the innate opportunities, the innate potential, you might call it that way. The potential is there, and then there should be the experience how to operate these tools. So this distinction is very important. It goes in fact for many cognitive capabilities, including the use of grammatical rules. Okay, so that is about Bandura, a very important psychologist. He also developed, the concept of self-efficacy, as we discussed in the previous module. But his view on how the social aspect of observation is very relevant for learning is still very important. Okay. That is about Bandura. Then we move to Vygotsky. Vygotsky is a lot earlier, in the 20th century. And Vygotsky also had a very strong idea about, you know, the social environment as an important basis for cognitive development. So we are talking about this social environment and about the cultural tools which come from the social environment and are internalized. And then we address the issue of the zone of proximal development. First, the idea of the social environment. The idea is basically that the environment in which we live, the cultural environment in which we live, does contain a lot of tools, as we're talking about the tools of the mind, and these tools have to be further developed and have to be internalized. So, for instance, language, but also, you know, computers or other cognitive tools, mathematics as a corpus of knowledge, is out there, and it has to be internalized in order to be able to use it. So the idea is that the environment contains all these very important cognitive tools, and there are others, parents, teachers, peers, who actually mediate, who enable you or introduce you to this environment, enable you to use the tools which are there in a gradual way, step by step. As we were talking about tools when we were discussing Bandura, tools of the mind, which may be located in a language acquisition device or whatever structure you are thinking of. That's one basis, you know, of the development of cognitive skills. But the other basis is obviously the environment, because a lot of tools are also there, stored there. Your use of the computer, your use of Wikipedia, for instance, or your use of all kinds of academic and scientific sources, like published articles, etc., is an example of, you know, internalizing these external knowledge and tools, etc. Okay. So you need, that's the basic idea, the environment in order to be able also to develop your internal tools. As children are at school, you know, they need the environment of the school, the teachers, the peers, in order to be able to develop their own tools of the mind. Okay, so here is the interaction, you know, between the individual and his or her let's say, significant others in the environment, the parents, the teachers, and the peers. Now, the interesting thing is that Vygotsky makes a distinction between two kinds of concepts, natural concepts and scientific concepts. It's an interesting distinction. Natural concepts come up, you know, are basically a bottom-up, you know, a sort of, you know, structure, cognitive structure, which is developed by acting, by being in the environment. So a lot of concepts like table, chair, or you name it, the day-to-day concepts you use maybe have been developed just by interacting with tables and chairs and pens and pencils and whatever you think of. And by interacting in this way, you develop, you know, your knowledge about this particular thing or concept. That's the natural way, so to speak. That's the case with natural concepts. But there is also a possibility to acquire concepts by through the teacher who explains a particular concept, and then it's a matter of top-down, you know. Then the teacher does explain to you what, let's say, freedom means, or democracy means, or a cube, what kind of characteristics a cube has, and what the theorem of Pythagoras is about, etc., etc. So all these kinds of scientific concepts, as Vygotsky calls them, they are, you know, handed over, transferred through the mediation of the teacher. What is important here is that these two concepts, as seen by Vygotsky, do exist. I emphasize this because in certain domains, for instance, in the domain of teacher education, in which a lot of you may be active, in the domain of teacher education, the idea has arisen that teachers should develop their knowledge and skills of teaching in the classroom. So that sitting, in a course, in a teacher education course, and being confronted with all kinds of theoretical ideas about what good teaching entails does not make sense, because you cannot use these scientific knowledge in practice, these scientific concepts in practice. That's the basic idea. You have to develop the concepts yourself by acting and by being in the classroom and by teaching. So there has been a strong tendency the last 10 years, let's say, or even longer, to reduce, the input of science, of learning psychology and teaching psychology and motivation and everything, because the idea is that these concepts, these psychological concepts, do not make sense before you actually embark on the very dangerous, journey of teaching. So, but I just emphasize this, that there is another view, and this view is supported, for instance, by Vygotsky, who maintains that apart from these natural concepts, there is also the existence of scientific concepts, which are transferred to you through the mediation of teachers. Okay. I hope you are not disturbed by the noise. We are in a new apartment here, so people are in other neighboring apartments are trying to find to find their way in their own house. Okay, so enough about this issue of development in the social environment. Oh yeah, as I already said, the quotation is by Vygotsky: the development of the child's spontaneous natural concepts proceeds upward, and the development of his scientific concepts downward to a more elementary and concrete level, as we discussed. Okay. The next step. As I said, cultural tools are internalized. So symbols, the language we use, the symbols of our mathematical systems, these are all tools of the mind. So the symbols do have characteristics which makes them very useful in doing arithmetic or in applying grammatical rules. Culture provides these tools, as I said, like technology and language. And the internalization takes place through imitation, from interpersonal to intrapersonal. So you observe teachers or peers using these tools, and you gradually through imitation internalize the use of these tools. That's the process, as we also discussed with Bandura. Okay. A very concrete example of such a process is the concept of the zone of proximal development. First of all, the definition, what a child can do in cooperation today, he can do alone tomorrow. Therefore, the only good kind of instruction is that which marches ahead of development and leads it. A very important statement, I think. Perhaps it's even as important as the statement that you have to identify what students already know and teach them accordingly. The Ausubel statement we were encountering earlier. What a child can do in cooperation today, he can do alone tomorrow. So there's something, the marching ahead deals with skills, cognitive skills, which cannot be performed by the child alone at this particular moment. So the child needs the teacher or the other, the significant other, in order to be able to complete these kind of tasks, these skills, to use these skills. So together with the teacher, the child is in fact able to perform what has to be done. And good instruction makes use of this possibility human beings have to learn through imitation. So you have to create a distance between what the teacher does and what the child already can do, and this distance makes it enables the child to develop new cognitive skills, because the child wants to bridge through imitation the distance with the teacher. And that is basically what the zone of proximal development is about. This is the distance, this is the zone where teacher and student operate cooperatively to enable the child, the student, to develop cognitive skills. Vygotsky makes a distinction between 4 stages, in fact. The first stage is the stage in which, so you have to see these stages as steps, in the process of gradually transferring the mastery of cognitive skills from the teacher, from the environment, to the student. Okay, in the first stage, during the first stage, the teacher, the adult, is responsible. So the adult demonstrates how a problem is to be solved, and the child follows the adult. So the adult shows, and in a very clear way and step-by-step way, how a problem is solved, and the child follows the adult and imitates what the adult does. That's the first stage. Now, the second stage starts when the child starts to understand the adult, so starts to build a sort of, internal representation of what the adult does, in which relationships are made, initial relationships. So the child starts to participate in the process of problem solving, and actually does, come up perhaps with ideas what to do in the next step, etc. So there's a gradual understanding, a gradual representation of the rationale behind, the behavior of the adult during the process of problem solving. And this rationale, inspires the child to also raise some ideas. In the third step, this is basically further and more deeply developed and elaborated. So the child connects activity with language, begins to take responsibility for solution processes. So the child is going to talk, about how to solve the problem. So the child develops the language which allows him or her to talk about the process of problem solving in a particular context. That is a very important next step. And the fourth and final step is, of course, the step in which this child arrives at complete understanding, and verbal actions are completely internalized, and the child becomes responsible for the solution process. So the child is completely in command now, has a full command of the language, and is able to solve a problem in the particular context in which the learning has been taken place. Also, an important thing is that understanding is decontextualized, which is to say that in the succession of problems which are solved, which are all examples of a particular sort of prototypical problem, in the process of solving these various examples, gradually the child begins to understand what the prototype or the prototypical problem is behind all these examples. So the particular acts and peculiarities of a concrete problem are detached, so to speak, from the understanding as such. And so the understanding is decontextualized and is a full understanding, basically. So these are the 4 stages which together form the process in which student and teachers operate in the zone of proximal development in order to be able to understand and to use a particular cognitive skills. Okay. Now, the third source of inspiration in this learning as a social process module is Mikhail Bakhtin. He was not a psychologist, but he was a philosopher and a literary critic. We see his picture here, and well, it's a very nice and more or less prototypical Russian intellectual, which is on the photo here. He does resemble Dostoevsky, definitely, and other very important and romantic, authors. So Bakhtin stands in that tradition as a literary critic, and his most important point is that understanding is multi-voiced, as he calls it, which is to say that when you understand what democracy is, for instance, let's take a very abstract example. You are hearing the voice, so in your head, of many authors, perhaps politicians, who talk about democracy and who have their ideas. So their ideas are in your head, so to speak, in a more or less decontextualized form. So you hear these various voices, ideas about democracy. And what you understand about the concept is a sort of reflection on all these different views. They are not necessarily integrated in a stable and solid, concept. They may live their life in your head as long as you are able to move from the one point of view to the other point of view, and to juggle with these points of view, so to speak, and together, use them to express your own ideas about what democracy entails. So the engagement is the engagement with the various voices, the various points of view, basically, which you may not adopt or may not completely adopt or may reject. But which all together influence your ideas, your personal view on what democracy is. Okay, so that's the idea of understanding as put forward by Michael Bakhtin. And there are several processes, and they all have to do with, interacting with your environment, with other people in your environment. Meaning appropriation means that you, as I said, you develop the meaning of a concept, an abstract concept, out of the meanings which you encounter when you talk with other people. So concepts have a social origin, and through the process of negotiation, shared understanding and co-construction does take place. Let's explore an example of, here's once again Mr. Bakhtin. I was planning to show you the example. Yes, let's explore an example of an interaction between a teacher and a student, in which you can see how this process of meaning in negotiation takes place. The teacher asks the student, tell me what metacognition means. So the teacher actually asks for a sort of explanation or definition or elaboration on the concept of metacognition. And then the student replies with an example. A PhD student who can explain how she constructs an introduction of an article out of a set of index cards with separate ID units disposes of metacognition. Okay, she gives an example. And then the teacher reflects with, so you mean that metacognition is the ability to construct a text out of individual ID units. That's one of the, the backbones, let's say, of this example. So constructing a text out of individual ID units. Then the student realizes that she gave an example and not an explanation of the concept as such. So she answers, no, I mean more generally knowledge about cognitive strategies, like writing expository text. So I just gave an example. And it is knowledge about strategies, cognitive strategies. That's what metacognition is about. For example, when a violin student interrupts playing a sonata whenever he hears a flat or a wrong note, and starts to repeat the difficult bars, this student disposes of metacognitive skill, carefully listening, stopping when something goes wrong, and repeating the difficult passage. And then the teacher replies, we now have 2 examples of metacognition. Could you please try again to explain the meaning of metacognition? And then the student gives a sort of interpretation. So metacognition entails knowledge about cognitive processes and systems, and control and monitor cognitive processes. So here is the definition, and then the teacher replies with, I understand. The interesting thing here is that the meaning negotiation process helps students to realize that she was not already at the level of giving a sort of general definition or explanation of the concept, but she was starting to give examples, and then the teacher gave the interpretation, like, so this is what you mean by metacognition, constructing a text out of individual idea units. And then the student realizes, no, that's not what I mean. Your reflection is correct, but it's I realize that I was not complete, or I didn't really grasp the issue of metacognition. And then the student starts to give another example, and then by interacting with the teacher, the student arrives at a definition, which is in fact a very complete definition of what metacognition entails. So this confrontation, and that's the point, the meaning negotiation part, that helps the student to become aware of what she in this case considers as metacognition. Okay, so now we have discussed Bakhtin, the process of meaning negotiation, which is another basic concept, I think, in the issue of learning as a social process. Let's try to focus now on a particular model, cognitive apprenticeship, which has been developed in the 80s as definitely, let's say, a product of the constructivist approach, the constructivist view on teaching and learning. And this model of cognitive apprenticeship is let's say, has a couple of characteristics which we go quickly through. Okay, the first one is, let's say, a definition. Cognitive apprenticeship focuses on the relationship between master and apprentice. The master models, coaches, scaffolds, encourages the apprentice to articulate, reflect, and explore. So it was, for instance, Lauren Resnick, I remember very well in one of the early conferences in the 80s, who said, well, we have to get rid of the very abstract, environment of the classroom, which, of course, Dewey also was already emphasizing. The classroom, students sitting in a row, listening to the teacher who explains everything. And there is no activity, there's no interaction, basically. But the student does not learn by doing, by performing, by interacting with the environment. And that's what happens in the workshop. If we have a carpenter or whatever you like as a workshop, that the apprentice learns from the master by observing, by imitating, by interacting with the master. And all these activities are very relevant in the process of learning, and therefore Resnick and other people coined the concept of cognitive apprenticeship to emphasize these social aspects of learning. The master models, coaches, scaffolds, encourages the apprentice to articulate, to reflect and explore, as we saw already also in the example of Bakhtin's meaning negotiation concept. A second important characteristic is that cognition is situated. Understanding is tied to the context in which it was acquired. School as a context differs from the professional context for which cognition has been constructed. So if you want students to use their knowledge in the appropriate context of their professional environment, then you should bring them into that environment and teach them the concepts in interaction with that environment. Another argument in favor of the idea that the school should be a sort of workshop, a cognitive workshop, or should have the characteristics of workshops as we know them in the professional world. Because, you know, the knowledge is bound and it is connected to the environment in which it has been acquired. And whenever you want to use knowledge, you should acquire this knowledge, skills, declarative procedural knowledge in the environment in which it has to be used. Okay, so the third argument, subject matter not only entails domain-specific knowledge and skills, but also heuristics, control strategies, and learning strategies. So students not only acquire the concepts, for instance, in the mathematical domain, you know, the concept of the triangle or the law of Archimedes or whatever, or Pythagoras, but they also develop heuristics, so knowledge about how to use knowledge, the control strategies, skills to control whether your problem-solving process has come to a right end. Learning strategies, how to, you know, tackle a particular learning task. And these strategies are as important as Schoenfeld emphasized, Alan Schoenfeld, as the subject matter knowledge as such. And therefore, Schoenfeld spent a lot of time as a mathematics teacher to show and to model how he actually applied these control strategies and heuristics in order to solve a particular mathematics problem. Okay, as I already said, the master is very important in the cognitive, in the workshop, in the cognitive apprenticeship situation. The master models by demonstrating task performance. The master encourages apprentices to autonomously complete tasks by providing coaching and scaffolding, and the master fosters articulation and reflection to promote mindful abstraction. Now, this is definitely a matter of, you know, learning by observation. All the stuff developed by Bandura is relevant here. And of course, you can imagine that in such a workshop environment, the master is really the source, you know, of all the learning that the apprentice tries to complete and bring to a good end. Okay. The curriculum is a gradual, you know, structure, a gradual build-up from simple to complex, from homogeneous tasks to diverse contexts, from general to detailed mastery. So you have to help take the student, the apprentice, and bring him or her step by step to the mastery of the complex skills, which are the goal of a particular learning assignment. So the gradual build-up is also important. So like it is, you know, in the usual workshop, where the apprentice does not start with complex, you know, assignments, but starts with simple assignments. Okay, and then of course the context. The apprentice learns to value the importance of expertise. Apprentices are intrinsically motivated to acquire knowledge and skills, not for grades, but for meaningful performance. They learn to benefit from collaboration and competition. They do a lot on meaning negotiation, articulation. This contributes to the development of metacognitive skill, knowledge and skills. Learning in a social environment represents the future professional environment. And in fact, what you can see is that in the community of learners, as we already encountered it and will encounter it again in the assignment of this module, the principles of cognitive apprenticeship are applied. So you see that basic ideas put forward by Bandura, by Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development, and by Bakhtin are implemented, are, let's say, made concrete in this concept of cognitive apprenticeship as we have now very shortly explored it, in fact.